The thunder of hooves shattered the tranquility of the Colorado plains as Delilah Kincaid's knuckles turned white around the reins of her wagon. Time seemed to slow as she watched a massive cloud of dust billow on the horizon, the ground beneath her trembling with the approaching danger of wild mustangs charging directly toward her. It was 1876, 2 years after Delilah had arrived in Fort Collins, Colorado, with dreams as vast as the territory itself. At 24, she had left behind the suffocating confines of Boston society to claim the small parcel of land her late uncle had left her. The 5 acres sat just outside town, and while modest, it represented something she'd never had before freedom. Delilah had been returning from town with supplies when she'd first heard the distant rumble. Now, as the herd of at least 50 wild horses barreled toward her, panic seized her chest. Her wagon was no match for their collective force. The 2 workhorses pulling her wagon sensed the danger and began to rear, threatening to overturn the entire rig. "Whoa, easy," she shouted, struggling to control the panicked animals, but her voice was lost in the growing thunder of approaching hooves. Just as Delilah was certain she faced her end, a blur of movement caught her peripheral vision. A rider on a powerful black stallion galloped from the east, racing perpendicular to the stampede. The man rode with such confidence that for a moment she forgot her terror and simply watched. He positioned himself between the oncoming herd and her wagon, waving his hat and shouting. His stallion danced skillfully as they created a moving barrier. The lead horses of the stampede hesitated, then began to turn, the rest of the herd following their lead like water diverted by a stone. The massive force of wild horses curved away from her wagon, continuing their thunderous journey in a new direction. As the dust began to settle, Delilah's rescuer trotted his horse toward her. He tipped back his hat, revealing eyes as blue as the Colorado sky and a face weathered by sun and wind. His clothing was simple but well-maintained, the practical garb of a working cowboy. "Madam," he greeted, his voice deep and steady. "You all right?" Delilah nodded, still too shaken to speak. Up close, she could see he was perhaps in his early 30s, with sandy brown hair and a strong jawline shadowed by several days' worth of stubble. "Those mustangs have been causing trouble all season," he continued. "Name's Tucker Winters. I run cattle on the North Range." "Delilah Kincaid," she managed, finding her voice at last. "I have the small homestead just past Willow Creek." "Kincaid Place," he nodded with recognition. "Heard someone had taken it over. Didn't realize it was a lady on her own." There was no judgment in his tone, merely statement of fact, but Delilah still felt the need to defend herself. "I'm managing just fine, Mr. Winters," she said, lifting her chin slightly. "And I'm extremely grateful for your intervention today." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Most folks around here just call me Tucker, and anyone would have done the same." "Perhaps, but it was you who did," Delilah replied. "You saved my life. I don't know how to thank you properly." Tucker settled back in his saddle. "No thanks necessary, Miss Kincaid. Though I wouldn't say no to a cup of coffee if you're offering. Been in the saddle since dawn." Delilah hesitated only momentarily before nodding. "Of course. My place isn't far. It's the least I can do." As they traveled the remaining distance to her homestead, Delilah's heartbeat slowly returned to normal. She cast occasional glances at the cowboy riding alongside her wagon. Tucker Winters sat easy in the saddle, his posture reflecting years spent on horseback. There was something reassuring about his presence, solid and unassuming, yet undeniably capable. Her homestead came into view, a modest cabin with a small barn and corral. She'd spent the past 2 years improving it, learning to repair fences and patch the roof, skills she never imagined needing in her former life. "It's not much," she said as they approached, suddenly self-conscious about the simplicity of her home. "Looks like good, honest living to me," Tucker replied, dismounting with fluid grace when they reached the yard. He helped her down from the wagon, his hands strong and steady at her waist. The brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through her that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. Delilah busied herself with unhitching her team while Tucker saw to his own mount. Together, they unloaded her supplies, working in companionable silence. Inside the cabin, she put coffee on to boil and set out some bread and preserves. "You've done well with this place," Tucker commented, looking around appreciatively at the neat interior. "Most newcomers don't last through their first winter." "I'm more stubborn than I look," Delilah replied, pouring the coffee. "Though I'll admit there were nights I questioned my sanity." Tucker chuckled, a warm sound that filled the small space. Territory has a way of testing folks, separates those who belong from those who don't. "And which am I, Mr. Winters?" Delilah asked, surprised by her own boldness. He studied her for a long moment. "I reckon you belong just fine, Miss Kincaid. Not everyone would face down a stampede without losing their head." "I was terrified," she admitted. "Being afraid isn't what matters. It's what you do while you're afraid that counts." He sipped his coffee. "This is mighty fine, by the way." As afternoon slipped toward evening, they shared stories. Tucker told her of growing up in Texas before coming north with a cattle drive 5 years earlier. He'd saved enough to start his own small operation, running about 200 head of cattle on land he was still paying for. Delilah shared how she'd come west after her parents passed within months of each other, leaving her with little but her uncle's deed, and a yearning for something different than the marriage her parents had arranged. "Freedom's a powerful draw," Tucker said, understanding in his eyes. "Can't fault anyone for chasing it." When he finally stood to leave, the sun was setting, painting the plains in gold and crimson. "I should get back. Got cattle to check on come morning." "Of course." Delilah walked him to the door. "Thank you again, Tucker. Not just for earlier, but for the company." He settled his hat on his head. "It was my pleasure, Miss Kincaid." "Delilah, please." His smile reached his eyes this time. "Delilah, then." He mounted his horse with practiced ease. "If you need anything, my place is about 5 miles north. Anyone can point you the way." She watched him ride away until he was just a silhouette against the darkening sky, surprised by the odd sense of loss she felt at his departure. Shaking it off, she returned inside to finish putting away her supplies, trying to ignore how much emptier the cabin seemed now. The following week passed in the usual routine of chores and tasks that kept her small homestead running, but Delilah found her thoughts repeatedly drifting to the cowboy who had saved her. She told herself it was merely gratitude, nothing more. On Saturday, she hitched her wagon to go into Fort Collins for supplies. The town had grown considerably since she'd first arrived, now boasting several stores, a hotel, and 2 saloons in addition to the original trading post and livery. As she secured her team outside the general store, a familiar voice called her name. She turned to see Tucker approaching, his hat in hand. "Miss Kincaid, Delilah," he corrected himself. "Good to see you in town." "Tucker," she smiled, unable to hide her pleasure at the chance encounter. "Are you well?" "Can't complain," he replied. "Just picking up some supplies myself. May I help you with your list?" They moved through the store together, gathering what each needed. Tucker reached the items on high shelves that Delilah couldn't, and she helped him select proper coffee, declaring his usual purchase fit only for cowboys with no taste buds. They drew curious glances from other customers, but Delilah found she didn't mind. There was an ease between them that defied their brief acquaintance. I'm having dinner at the hotel restaurant, Tucker said as they loaded their purchases into their respective conveyances. Nothing fancy, but the food's decent. Would you care to join me? Delilah hesitated. Dining in public with a man she barely knew would certainly set tongues wagging, but something in his straightforward invitation appealed to her independent spirit. I'd like that, she decided. Thank you. The hotel restaurant was busy but not crowded. They found a table near the window, and Tucker pulled out her chair with unexpected gentility. Their conversation flowed naturally, covering everything from the unusually wet spring to the new railroad spur being planned for Fort Collins. The railroad will change everything, Tucker remarked. Bring more settlers, more business. Change isn't always bad, Delilah said, though I admit I'd hate to see some of the wildness tamed. Tucker studied her with new interest. Most women I know can't wait for civilization to fully arrive. I didn't come west for civilization, she replied simply. I had plenty of that in Boston. Their meal was interrupted when the door burst open and a group of rowdy cowboys entered, clearly having already visited one of the saloons. One of them spotted Tucker and called out, "Winters. Thought that was your horse outside. Come have a drink with us." Tucker nodded politely but declined. "Another time, boys. I'm having dinner." The cowboy's gaze shifted to Delilah, his eyes widening slightly. "Well now, don't let us interrupt your courting, Winters." Delilah felt her cheeks warm, but Tucker merely smiled. "Miss Kincaid and I are just enjoying a meal, Carter. Mind your manners." The men moved on to another table, though Delilah noticed they continued casting curious glances their way. "I apologize for that," Tucker said quietly. "There's no need," she assured him. "I'm well aware that a woman living alone is always subject to gossip. Adding dinner with a handsome cowboy merely gives them something new to discuss." Tucker's eyes crinkled with amusement. "Handsome, is it?" Delilah realized what she'd said and felt heat rise to her face again. "I simply meant, I know what you meant," he interrupted gently, "and I'm flattered." After dinner, Tucker insisted on escorting her to her wagon. "It's getting dark," he said. "I'd feel better knowing you got home safely." "I've made the trip dozens of times," Delilah protested, though not very strongly. "Humor me," Tucker replied, already moving to saddle his horse. The ride back to her homestead was peaceful, the spring evening cool but pleasant. They traveled mostly in comfortable silence, occasionally commenting on the beauty of the star-filled sky or pointing out wildlife visible in the moonlight. At her cabin, Tucker helped her unload her supplies and stable her horses. When all was settled, they stood somewhat awkwardly on her porch. "Thank you for the escort," Delilah said, "and for dinner." Tucker shifted his weight, suddenly seeming less sure of himself than he had all evening. "I enjoyed your company, Delilah, very much." There was a question in his eyes, one that made her heart beat a little faster. But he merely touched the brim of his hat and stepped back. "Good night," he said. "I hope I'll see you again soon." "I'd like that," Delilah replied honestly. As spring blossomed into summer, Tucker found increasingly frequent reasons to ride by Delilah's homestead. Sometimes, he brought game he'd hunted or extra vegetables from his own small garden. Other times, he simply stopped to help with repairs or heavy work before continuing on his way. Delilah began to look forward to his visits, planning her days so she'd be home when he typically passed by. She told herself it was practical, an extra pair of hands was always useful, but in her heart, she knew it was more. One particularly hot July afternoon, Tucker arrived to find Delilah attempting to repair her chicken coop. Without a word, he dismounted and took the hammer from her hand, finishing the job in half the time it would have taken her. "I could have managed," she said, though she was grateful for the help. "Never doubted it," Tucker replied with a smile. But why should you when I'm here? They sat on her porch afterward, drinking cool water and watching thunderclouds build on the distant horizon. Tucker seemed preoccupied, unusually quiet even for him. "Is something troubling you?" Delilah finally asked. He looked at her directly, his blue eyes serious. "I've been offered a job, Delilah. Good money, driving a herd to Wyoming." Her heart sank, though she kept her expression neutral. "That sounds like a fine opportunity." "It would mean being gone for at least 2 months, possibly 3. He watched her closely as he spoke. "I'd leave right after the Harvest Festival next week." "Well, Delilah hesitated, unsure what to say. She had no claim on him, no right to be disappointed. "I hope it goes well for you." Tucker continued to study her. "You know, most folks would ask why I'd consider it, given I have my own spread to run." Delilah realized he was right. "I assumed you had your reasons." "I do." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm saving to buy more land, the parcel that connects my property to the North Creek." He paused. "And the parcel that borders your homestead to the east." Her eyes widened in surprise. "You want to expand this far?" "I want to be closer to what matters," Tucker said simply. "But I need to be able to offer more than a small cattle operation and a half-built house." The implication of his words hung between them, neither quite ready to acknowledge it directly. "The Harvest Festival," Delilah said finally. "Will you be attending?" Tucker nodded. "I wouldn't miss it. It's the biggest social event until Christmas." "Then perhaps we could attend together," she suggested, gathering her courage. "If you'd like to, that is." The smile that spread across Tucker's face made her heart flutter. "I'd like that very much, Delilah." The week leading up to the festival passed in a flurry of preparation. Delilah spent hours baking pies for the community table, and even more hours deciding what to wear. She finally settled on her best dress, blue calico with delicate white embroidery at the collar and cuffs. She'd made it herself over the winter, saving it for special occasions. When Tucker arrived to escort her to town, he too had made an effort. His usual work clothes had been replaced by clean trousers, a pressed shirt, and a vest she'd never seen before. He'd even trimmed his beard and slicked back his hair. "You look beautiful," he said when she emerged from the cabin. "Thank you," Delilah replied, suddenly shy. "You clean up rather well yourself, Mr. Winters." The festival was held in the town square, with tables laden with food, musicians playing lively tunes, and lanterns strung from posts to illuminate the gathering as dusk fell. Delilah knew most of the townspeople now, but being there with Tucker felt different, like a declaration of sorts. Mrs. Peterson, the baker's wife, raised her eyebrows knowingly when they approached together. "Well now, isn't this a fine sight?" she said. "Tucker Winters finally found someone worth putting on his good boots for." Tucker took the teasing good-naturedly, his hand resting lightly at the small of Delilah's back as he guided her through the crowd. They ate at the communal tables, visited with neighbors, and listened to speeches from the mayor and other prominent citizens. As the night wore on, the musicians struck up a waltz and couples began to claim the cleared space for dancing. "May I have this dance?" Tucker asked, extending his hand. Delilah hesitated. "I should warn you, I haven't danced in years." "Then we'll fumble through together," he replied with a reassuring smile. His hand was warm around hers as he led her to the dance floor. He placed his other hand properly at her waist, maintaining a respectable distance between them. As they began to move to the music, Delilah was surprised by how naturally they fell into step together. "You dance very well for a cowboy," she remarked. Tucker chuckled. "My mother insisted all her boys learn, said no son of hers would embarrass a lady on the dance floor." "A wise woman," Delilah said, relaxing into his lead. As the music continued, other couples joined them. Delilah caught sight of Mrs. Peterson whispering to her husband, both watching them with evident approval. "We're causing quite a stir," she murmured to Tucker. "Does that bother you?" He asked, his expression suddenly serious. Delilah considered the question honestly. "No," she decided. "It doesn't." His eyes warmed and his hand tightened slightly at her waist. "Good." They danced 3 more dances before taking a break to enjoy some punch. The evening air had cooled, and Tucker draped his coat over Delilah's shoulders without being asked. "Would you like to take a walk?" he suggested. "It's a bit quieter by the creek." She nodded, and they slipped away from the festivities, following the path that led to the small creek that ran behind the town. The sounds of music and laughter faded as they walked, replaced by the gentle gurgling of water over rocks and the chorus of night insects. They stopped at a bench beneath a large cottonwood tree. The moon was nearly full, casting enough light to see clearly despite the late hour. "I've been thinking about your job offer," Delilah said after they'd sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes. Tucker turned to look at her. "Have you now?" "Yes, and I think you should take it." He seemed surprised. "You do?" Delilah nodded. "If it's what you want, what you need to achieve your goals, then yes." Tucker studied her face in the moonlight. "I'll miss you," he said quietly. "And I'll miss you," she admitted, her heart pounding. "But you'll come back." It wasn't a question, but Tucker answered anyway. "Yes, I'll come back to you, Delilah, if that's what you want." She found herself suddenly breathless. "It is." Tucker's hand found hers, his fingers intertwining with her own. "May I write to you while I'm gone?" "I'd be disappointed if you didn't," she replied. He smiled and lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. The simple gesture sent a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the summer night. "Tucker," she began, then hesitated, unsure how to express what she was feeling. "I know," he said softly. "Me too." They returned to the festival hand in hand, both aware that something significant had shifted between them. When Tucker escorted her home later that night, he kissed her properly on her porch, a sweet, gentle kiss that promised more to come. "I'll stop by tomorrow before I head out," he said as they reluctantly parted. Delilah nodded, her lips still tingling from his kiss. "Be careful, Tucker. Come back to me." "Wild horses couldn't keep me away," he promised, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he referenced their first meeting. True to his word, Tucker arrived early the next morning to say goodbye. He brought a small wooden box and pressed it into her hands. "What's this?" Delilah asked, opening it to find a simple silver locket inside. "It was my mother's," Tucker explained. "I'd like you to have it, to remember me by until I return." Delilah was touched by the gesture. "It's beautiful, Tucker, thank you." He helped her fasten it around her neck, his fingers lingering against her skin. 3 months at the most," he said. "I'll send letters whenever I can." Their goodbye was tender but quick, neither wanting to prolong the pain of separation. Delilah watched him ride away, the silver locket cool against her skin, a tangible reminder of his promise to return. The first month of Tucker's absence passed slowly. Delilah threw herself into work on her homestead, harvesting her small vegetable garden and preparing for the coming winter. His first letter arrived 3 weeks after he'd left, carried by a friend returning from Cheyenne. She read it so many times the paper began to wear at the folds. He wrote of the cattle drive, the long days, the challenges of river crossings, the beauty of the land they traversed. But mostly he wrote of his thoughts of her, his plans for the future, and his counting of days until he could return. Delilah wrote back immediately, sending her letter with the next supply wagon heading north. She told him of the happenings in Fort Collins, the progress on her homestead, and her own growing feelings for him. Writing the words was easier than saying them aloud, and she found herself being more open on paper than she might have been in person. As summer gave way to fall, Delilah received word that Tucker's return might be delayed. Heavy rains had washed out trails, making travel difficult. She tried not to worry, reminding herself that he was experienced and capable. October arrived with its brilliant colors and crisp mornings. Delilah had just finished chopping wood for her stove when she heard a horse approaching. Her heart leapt, thinking it might be Tucker, but it was instead his neighbor, Robert Miller. "Miss Kincaid," he called, dismounting quickly. "Thought you should know there's been trouble up north." Group of rustlers hit several herds, including some being driven back from Wyoming. Fear gripped her heart. "Tucker's herd," Miller nodded grimly. "Word is there was a fight. Some men were hurt. I don't have details, but I knew you'd want to know." Delilah pressed a hand to the locket at her throat. "Thank you, Mr. Miller. If you hear anything more, I'll come straight away," he promised. The next 3 days were the longest of Delilah's life. She found herself unable to concentrate on anything, jumping at every sound, hoping for news. On the 4th morning, she decided she couldn't wait any longer. She would go to Fort Collins and see if the telegraph office had any information. She was halfway through hitching her wagon when she heard hoofbeats on the road. Shading her eyes against the autumn sun, she made out a single rider approaching slowly. Even at a distance, she recognized Tucker's broad-shouldered silhouette. Relief flooded through her, followed quickly by concern at his slow pace. As he drew closer, she could see he was slumped slightly in the saddle, and his left arm was bound in a makeshift sling. "Tucker," she cried, running to meet him as he reached her yard. He managed a tired smile. "Told you I'd come back." Delilah helped him dismount, alarmed at his grimace of pain as his feet touched the ground. "You're hurt. What happened?" "Rustlers," he confirmed, leaning on her more heavily than she suspected he wanted to. "They hit us just south of Laramie, got about 30 head before we drove them off." She guided him into the cabin and helped him to a chair. "Mr. Miller told me there was trouble, but not details. I've been so worried." Tucker caught her hand as she fussed over him. "I'm all right, Delilah. Took a bullet in the shoulder, but the doctor in Cheyenne patched me up good. It's mostly healed now, just sore." Delilah fetched water and clean cloths, insisting on checking his wound herself. The bullet had indeed passed through cleanly, and while the area was still angry and red, it showed no signs of infection. "You're lucky," she said, carefully rewrapping his shoulder, "a few inches lower." "Wasn't luck," Tucker replied, his free hand touching the locket around her neck. "I had something important to come back for." Tears welled in Delilah's eyes. "I was so afraid when I heard." Tucker pulled her gently into his lap, his good arm wrapping around her waist. "I'm here now," he murmured against her hair, "and I don't plan on going anywhere for a good long while." She turned to face him, one hand coming up to touch his bearded cheek. "I love you, Tucker Winters. I think I have since you turned those wild horses away from my wagon." His eyes softened. "I love you too, Delilah Kincaid. Enough to ride 300 miles with a bum shoulder just to tell you so." Their kiss was deeper this time, filled with the relief of reunion and the promise of a shared future. When they finally parted, both were breathless. "Stay," Delilah said impulsively. "At least until you're fully healed. I can make up the spare room." Tucker considered her offer, then nodded. "That would be right practical. My place is a fair ride from here, and I admit I'm not up to it today." So began a new chapter in their relationship. Tucker stayed in Delilah's spare room, initially just to recover but gradually taking on more responsibilities around the homestead as his strength returned. They fell into an easy rhythm together, sharing meals and work, their conversations stretching late into the evenings. News of the arrangement raised some eyebrows in Fort Collins, but Delilah found she cared less about gossip than she once had. Tucker was unfailingly respectful, always mindful of her reputation, despite their growing intimacy. As November arrived with its first dusting of snow, Tucker announced that he had successfully purchased the additional land he'd been saving for. "The papers came through yesterday," he told Delilah over breakfast. "I own both parcels now, the one by the creek and the one bordering your eastern fence line." "That's wonderful news," she said sincerely. "You've worked so hard for this." Tucker set down his coffee cup, his expression turning serious. "There's more to it than just expanding my herd, Delilah. I've been building something these past few years, for a future I wasn't sure I'd ever have." He reached across the table to take her hand. "Would you ride out with me today? There's something I'd like to show you." "Curious," Delilah agreed. They set out after breakfast, riding east across her property and continuing another mile until they crested a gentle rise. Below them, nestled in a protected valley with a clear view of the mountains beyond, stood a house. Not a cabin or a simple homesteader's dwelling, but a proper house. It was 2 stories, with a wide porch wrapping around the front and side. Though clearly still under construction in places, the main structure was complete, windows already installed and a sturdy chimney rising from the center. "Tucker," Delilah breathed, taking in the sight. "What is this?" "Home," he said simply. "Or it will be. I've been building it for almost 2 years now, working on it whenever I could spare the time. That's really why I took the Wyoming job, needed the extra money to finish it properly before winter." Delilah turned to him, stunned. "It's beautiful. But I don't understand." Tucker dismounted and helped her down from her horse. Taking both her hands in his, he looked into her eyes with all the openness of his heart. "I started building it before I even knew you, Delilah. Had some fool idea that someday I'd find a woman who'd want to share my life out here. Then that day came when I saw your wagon and those wild horses, and suddenly the house wasn't just a dream anymore. It had a purpose." He dropped to one knee, still holding her hands. "Delilah Kincaid, I love you more than I ever thought possible. Would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife?" Tears spilled down Delilah's cheeks as joy overwhelmed her. "Yes, Tucker. Yes, with all my heart." He rose and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with all the passion they'd held in check for months. When they finally broke apart, he was smiling broadly. "Want to see inside your new home?" The interior was even more impressive than the outside. Tucker had clearly put thought into every detail: large windows to catch the mountain light, a spacious kitchen with built-in cabinets, a sitting room with a stone fireplace, and upstairs, 3 bedrooms. "The master bedroom faces east," Tucker explained as they toured the upper floor. "So you can see the sunrise over the plains." Delilah was touched by his thoughtfulness. "You've thought of everything." "Not everything," he admitted with a chuckle. "I figured you might want to have a say in curtains and such. Never was much good with those finishing touches." They spent the afternoon exploring the house and the surrounding land, Tucker pointing out his plans for expanding the barn and adding a larger garden. As the sun began to set, they sat on the porch steps, Delilah leaning against Tucker's good shoulder. "When would you like to have the wedding?" he asked, his arm warm around her waist. "I don't need anything elaborate," Delilah replied. "Perhaps before Christmas. That would give us time to move my things here and properly combine our households." Tucker kissed her temple. "Christmas it is, a new beginning for the new year." They were married 2 weeks before Christmas in Fort Collins' small church. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, attended by neighbors and the friends they'd each made in the territory. Delilah wore a new dress of deep blue wool, with Tucker's mother's locket around her neck. Tucker wore a new suit ordered special from Denver, looking so handsome that Delilah's breath caught when she first saw him waiting at the altar. The reception was held at the hotel, where well-wishers toasted their happiness and shared in a feast prepared by the women of the community. Mrs. Peterson had baked them a wedding cake decorated with sugared berries and pine sprigs in honor of the season. "To think," she said, embracing Delilah warmly, "all this happiness because of a stampede of wild horses. The Lord works in mysterious ways indeed." By evening's end, Tucker drove Delilah home in a new buggy, his wedding gift to her, to the house that was now truly theirs. He carried her over the threshold despite his still healing shoulder, setting her down gently in the entryway that was now hung with evergreen boughs and red ribbons for the holiday. "Welcome home, Mrs. Winters," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "It sounds wonderful when you say it," Delilah replied, reaching up to caress his face. "I love you, husband." "And I love you, wife," Tucker answered, bending to kiss her softly. "More than words can say." Their first winter as husband and wife was both challenging and deeply fulfilling. January brought heavy snows that isolated them for weeks at a time, but they found joy in their togetherness, establishing traditions and routines that would form the foundation of their married life. Tucker's wound healed completely by mid-February, allowing him to resume full duties around their expanded property. Together they planned for spring planting and the future of their combined operations. Tucker's cattle herd continued to grow, while Delilah expanded her vegetable garden and added a small orchard of apple and cherry trees that would bear fruit in years to come. When spring finally arrived in a burst of wildflowers and new grass, they rode out together to check fence lines and watch the first calves of the season find their wobbly legs. On one such ride in late April, they stopped to rest by a stream where wild lupines painted the banks in purple and blue. Delilah had been quieter than usual that morning, something Tucker noted with concern as they sat together on a fallen log. "You feeling all right?" he asked, passing her the canteen of water they shared. "You've seemed thoughtful today." She smiled, taking his hand and placing it gently on her still flat stomach. "I've been thinking about names, actually, for our child." Tucker stared at her for a long moment, then broke into the widest smile she'd ever seen on his face. "A baby. We're having a baby." Delilah nodded, laughing as he pulled her to her feet and spun her around carefully. "Yes, due in November, according to my calculations." Tucker set her down and knelt before her, pressing his lips to her stomach through her dress. "Hello in there," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm your pa, and I can't wait to meet you." Looking up at Delilah with eyes shining, he added, "I promise you both I'll be the best husband and father I know how to be." "You already are," Delilah assured him, running her fingers through his hair. "Our child is blessed to have you for a father." They named their son James Tucker Winters, after both Tucker's father and himself. He arrived on a snowy November evening with his mother's dark hair and his father's blue eyes, a perfect combination of them both. As Delilah held their newborn son while Tucker sat beside them on the bed, his arm protective around her shoulders, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a Boston society girl to a frontier wife and mother, from a woman alone facing a stampede of wild horses to half of a partnership stronger than she'd ever imagined possible. "What are you thinking?" Tucker asked softly, seeing her contemplative expression. "I'm thinking about those wild horses," she replied with a smile. "How something that seemed so frightening turned out to be the greatest blessing of my life." Tucker pressed a kiss to her temple, then one to his son's downy head. "Sometimes the most dangerous moments lead us exactly where we're meant to be." In the years that followed, the Winters family flourished. Their property expanded as their hard work and careful management yielded increasing success. 2 years after James was born, they welcomed a daughter, Elizabeth Rose, who had her mother's spirit and her father's way with horses. A second son, Michael, completed their family 3 years later. The West changed around them as Fort Collins grew from settlement to proper city. The railroad arrived, bringing increased commerce and new settlers. But through it all, Tucker and Delilah maintained the values that had brought them together: hard work, honesty, and an abiding love for the land and each other. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Tucker surprised Delilah by taking her to the exact spot where he had turned the stampeding horses away from her wagon a decade earlier. He'd arranged a picnic lunch, complete with a bottle of champagne from Denver and a blanket spread beneath the cottonwood tree that now marked the spot. "You remember that day?" he asked as they sat together, watching their 3 children play nearby, their laughter carrying on the warm summer breeze. "How could I forget?" Delilah replied, leaning against his shoulder. "I was terrified, then amazed by this cowboy who appeared out of nowhere to save me." Tucker chuckled, his arm tightening around her waist. "And I was just doing what needed doing, never expecting to find the woman who'd change my life forever." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "I know we don't usually do gifts for anniversaries, but this one seemed special." Inside was a delicate gold bracelet with 3 small charms: a horse, a wagon, and a heart. Delilah's eyes filled with tears as Tucker fastened it around her wrist. "It's beautiful," she whispered, "and perfect." "Like you," Tucker replied, kissing her softly. "Thank you for these 10 years, Delilah, for our children, our home, our life together." "And thank you for turning those wild horses away," she said with a smile. "My very own hero," Tucker laughed. "I was just in the right place at the right time." "No," Delilah said, taking his face in her hands. "You were exactly where you were meant to be, where we were both meant to be." As they called their children over to share the anniversary cake Delilah had baked, she looked around at the life they'd built together: their growing children, their prosperous land, and most importantly, the love that had begun with a chance encounter and a cowboy brave enough to create a barrier between danger and a woman he didn't yet know he would love for the rest of his life. In that moment, with the Colorado sun warming their shoulders and their family gathered close, Delilah knew with absolute certainty that some dangers were worth facing, some risks worth taking, and that sometimes the wildest journeys led to the most beautiful destinations. Years continued to pass, seasons changing from harsh winters to blooming springs, scorching summers to golden autumns. Fort Collins grew into a bustling city, while the Winters Ranch expanded to become one of the most respected operations in northern Colorado. Their children grew too. James, their firstborn, inherited his father's aptitude for ranching and gradually took on more responsibility managing the cattle operation. Elizabeth, their spirited daughter, developed a talent for breaking and training horses that even experienced cowboys came to respect. Young Michael showed an unexpected interest in medicine after a local doctor saved his life during a bout of pneumonia when he was 10. Through it all, the foundation of their family remained the strong bond between Tucker and Delilah. Their partnership deepened with each passing year, their love growing richer through shared joys and weathered hardships. When James married the daughter of a neighboring rancher at 23, the celebration was held on Winter's land, with over 200 guests attending the festivities. Delilah, now in her mid-40s but still striking with silver threads beginning to weave through her dark hair, watched with pride as her son began his own journey with a woman he loved. "Reminds me of another wedding, many years ago," Tucker murmured in her ear as they danced beneath lantern light, their son and new daughter-in-law twirling nearby. Ours was much smaller, Delilah reminded him with a smile. But just as meaningful, Tucker replied, his blue eyes still capable of making her heart skip after all these years. 2 years later, when they welcomed their first grandchild, a boy James and his wife named Thomas Tucker, after both grandfathers, Delilah found herself reflecting again on the path that had led her west. "I never imagined this life," she told Tucker as they sat together on their porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Baby Thomas slept peacefully in Tucker's arms, his tiny hand wrapped around his grandfather's weathered finger. "What did you imagine?" Tucker asked curiously. Delilah considered the question. "In Boston, I was expected to marry a businessman or lawyer, host dinner parties, and raise properly behaved children who would continue the social traditions." She shook her head slightly. "It seemed so. Confined." Tucker nodded thoughtfully. "And now, no regrets about choosing wild horses and cowboys instead?" "Not a single one," she assured him, leaning over to kiss his cheek. "This life, our life, has been more rewarding than anything I could have dreamed." As their family continued to grow, with Elizabeth marrying a young rancher from Wyoming and Michael departing for medical school in Denver, Tucker and Delilah began to consider the future of their legacy. "We should formalize how the property will be divided," Tucker suggested one evening as they reviewed their accounts. Now in his early 60s, he had developed reading glasses perched on his nose, though he remained strong and capable in all other respects. "I've been thinking about that too," Delilah agreed. "James will want the main cattle operation, of course. And Elizabeth has her eye on the eastern section for her horse breeding program," Tucker added. "Michael says he'll likely settle in town once he finishes his training, but we should set aside something for him as well." They spent weeks working through the details, ensuring each of their children would inherit not just land but a sustainable future. When the plans were complete, they invited all 3 children and their families to Sunday dinner to share their decisions. "Your mother and I want to be transparent about our intentions," Tucker explained after the meal, as they gathered in the sitting room. "We've built this ranch together, and we want to see it continue to thrive for generations." The children listened respectfully as their parents outlined the inheritance plans. James would receive the main homestead and cattle operation. Elizabeth would get the eastern parcel with its natural springs and gentle hills, perfect for her horses. And Michael would receive a combination of town properties they'd acquired over the years plus a smaller parcel of land, should he ever wish to return to rural life. "But most importantly," Delilah added, "we want you to know that this land represents more than just acreage or assets. It's the physical embodiment of a life built on love, hard work, and family. However you choose to use your portions, remember that." Later that night, after everyone had departed and the house was quiet once more, Tucker found Delilah standing at their bedroom window, gazing out at the moonlit landscape. "Penny for your thoughts," he said softly, coming up behind her to wrap his arms around her waist. "I was just thinking how fortunate we've been," she replied, leaning back against his chest. "To have built all this together, to have raised 3 wonderful children, to have found each other in the first place." Tucker rested his chin on her shoulder. "You know, I've never told you this, but I saw you in town before that day with the horses." Delilah turned in his arms, surprised. "You did," he nodded, a slight smile playing at his lips. "About a month earlier. You were at the general store, arguing with old Ferguson about the price of nails. Said you weren't about to be overcharged just because you were a woman doing her own repairs." "I remember that," Delilah laughed. "He reduced the price." "He did," Tucker confirmed. And I remember thinking, now there's a woman with spirit. Was too shy to introduce myself, though. Tucker Winters shy, Delilah teased. I find that hard to believe. Around beautiful, spirited women. Absolutely, he admitted. Took a stampede of wild horses for me to work up the courage to speak to you. Delilah's expression softened. I'm glad you did. I can't imagine my life without you in it. As they prepared for bed, Delilah found herself reflecting on how their love story had shaped not just their own lives, but the lives of their children, and now grandchildren. The legacy they were creating went beyond land and cattle. It was about values, about partnership, about building something meaningful together. The following spring brought both celebration and challenge. Elizabeth announced she was expecting her first child, news that filled the family with joy. But the same season brought devastating floods that damaged fences and drowned several head of cattle, requiring weeks of hard work to repair the damage. Through it all, Tucker and Delilah worked side by side, just as they had for over 30 years. Though they were no longer young, they remained strong and determined, facing each obstacle together. One evening, after a particularly long day of mending fences, they sat together on their porch swing, muscles aching but spirits undiminished. We should hire more help, Delilah suggested, massaging her husband's weathered hands. You're working too hard. Tucker shook his head stubbornly. I can still pull my weight. I know you can, she said gently, but you don't always have to. James wants to bring on 2 more hands anyway. Let him. After a moment's consideration, Tucker nodded. You're right, as usual. I suppose I need to accept that we're not as young as we once were. Perhaps not, Delilah agreed, but I wouldn't trade what we have now for all the youth in the world. Tucker's expression softened as he looked at his wife. Though time had lined her face and silvered her hair, to him she remained as beautiful as the day he'd first seen her facing down that stampede. Nor would I, he said sincerely. Elizabeth's daughter, named Delilah, rose after her grandmother arrived in late autumn, a healthy child with a strong set of lungs. The first time Delilah held her namesake, she felt a profound sense of continuity, of life cycling forward in the most beautiful way. She has your eyes, Tucker observed, peering over her shoulder at the infant. And your determined chin, Delilah replied with a smile. As winter settled once more over the Colorado plains, the Winters family gathered to celebrate Christmas in the home Tucker had built so many years ago. The house was full to bursting. James and his family, Elizabeth with her husband and new baby, Michael home from his medical practice in Denver, plus various in-laws and their 2 grandchildren old enough to run excitedly from room to room. After dinner, as the adults lingered around the table with coffee and pie, young Thomas, now 7, asked a question that caught everyone's attention. Grandpa, is it true you saved Grandma from wild horses when you were young? The room quieted as all eyes turned to Tucker, who smiled at his grandson's curiosity. That's right, Thomas. A whole herd of mustangs was charging right toward your grandmother's wagon. Were you scared, Grandma? Little Thomas asked, wide-eyed. Delilah nodded honestly. Terrified. But your grandfather was very brave. He rode between me and those horses and turned them away. Like a real hero, Elizabeth added with a fond smile at her father. Tucker shook his head modestly. I just did what needed doing. Anyone would have. But it wasn't anyone, Delilah said softly, reaching across the table to take his hand. It was you, and I've been grateful every day since. Later that night, after the house had quieted and their guests had retired to their rooms, Tucker and Delilah stood together by their bedroom window, watching snow fall gently in the moonlight. 40 years ago, I never would have pictured this, Tucker mused. This home, our children, grandchildren, all of it. What did you picture? Delilah asked. Tucker considered the question. Honestly, just survival, making it from one season to the next, building something that might last. He turned to look at her, his blue eyes still bright despite the lines that now framed them. Finding you changed everything, gave it all purpose. Delilah stepped into his embrace, resting her head against his chest where she could hear the steady beat of his heart. For me too. You saved me from those horses, but you also saved me from a life half lived. As they held each other, surrounded by the home they'd built and the family they'd created, both reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a chance encounter on the Colorado plains. From that moment of danger had blossomed decades of love, partnership, and shared purpose. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing their land in pristine white. Inside, wrapped in the warmth of their enduring love, Tucker and Delilah Winters stood as living testimony to the power of courage, commitment, and the unexpected ways in which life's greatest challenges often lead to its greatest blessings. What had begun with wild horses stampeding toward a lone woman's wagon had become a legacy of love that would continue long after they were gone, a story that would be told and retold through generations, inspiring their descendants to face their own challenges with the same courage and open hearts that had defined Tucker and Delilah's remarkable journey together.